This video covers the IGCSE Biology Objective 1.3.3 on the 2025 CAIE syllabus, which is to classify organisms in the animal kingdom. So let's remind ourselves of how we start the classification. So we're looking at the cells of the organisms to determine which type of kingdom they belong to by determining are they multicellular and if they have a membrane-bound nucleus. Then we're looking at if they're arthropods, if they have an exoskeleton and jointed legs, and if they're vertebrates, if they have a backbone. If we were looking at an arthropod, it would go into one of the four classes that we've already discussed, and we typically would look at the number of pairs of legs to determine where they belong, but there are other ways that we can also there are other features that we can look at that also would help us determine which of the four classes the organism belongs to. If we're looking at vertebrates, we're looking at 5 different classes, and typically we look at the body covering in order to determine which class an organism would belong to, but there are, again, other features that we could look at that would help us to determine which class of vertebrate the specific organism belongs to that we're looking at. So let's do some examples. So we've got 2 organisms here that are vertebrates. We're looking at that chart right now. They look very similar to each other, but they are in fact in different classes. So if we look at the outer covering of each of these organisms, organism A appears to have scales, and organism B does not appear to have scales. While they look very similar, they have long tails, body shape, legs kind of in the same position, they do seem to be different because of their body covering. So if we look at organism A, we can see that organism A has scales. It's living on land. We can determine this is a reptile. We see some eggshells there. So that kind of does make sense. For organism B, we can see the body is smooth. There's no hair, no fur, no feathers. So the skin looks a bit moist and naked, as we would call it, and so we can determine that this is an amphibian. And we do see that our assessment there is correct. All right, moving on to the arthropod phylum, we've got 2 organisms here. Looking quite similar, but we will be able to determine based on the features that they are in fact in 2 different classes. So let's take a look at the top organism. You may know that this is a scorpion, but let's look at the number of legs. So we've got what appears to be 5 pairs of legs. However, the front pair, the very large pincers that are there, are actually not legs. So if we look at the remaining legs, we have 8 legs, 4 pairs of legs. That tells us that this is an arachnid. Now, arachnids' bodies are divided into 2 regions, and those front pincers are actually on the front region, which is called the cephalothorax, and the legs are on the abdominal region of the body. Legs are always on the abdominal region, and anything that is on what would be considered the head of the organism is not a leg. So that is how we differentiate between the appendages on an arachnid. Are the appendages on their cephalothorax or the head, or are the appendages on the abdomen? The ones on the abdomen are the legs. So there are 8 legs. This is an arachnid. The other organism that we are looking at also appears to have 8 legs and then has also pincers, but we can see some other things there that will help us to classify it better. If we look at the front of the body, in front of the big pincers, we can see that there are some antennae, and we can also see other smaller legs there, really teeny tiny. And so what we can see is that there are in fact more than 4 pairs of legs on this particular organism, and it also has 2 pairs of antennae, the really long ones, and then there's some really short ones there. So if we look back at our little chart, that would tell us that this is a crustacean. It has 5 or more pairs of legs, and it also has 2 pairs of antennae, which no other organism in this particular category would share. So if we look at now the answers, we would see that indeed the top one is an arachnid, that is a scorpion, and the bottom one is a crustacean, that is a lobster. Okay, finally, let's take a look now at these organisms without the chart in front of us and see if we can determine what they are. So the first organism is something called a pangolin. It looks like it's covered with scales, but there also is some fur that you can see under its chin and maybe on its hands. And that is what makes this organism a mammal. The second organism is a myriapod. How do we know this? Well, we can just look at its body and the number of legs that it has. Clearly, many, many, many legs. And that's what myriapod means. It means many feet. So we don't have to count anything. Clearly, it's 10 or more. And so we know that it is in that particular category just by looking at the number of legs. And indeed, this is a giant millipede. The third organism that we have here has wings. So we might think, okay, it's a bird. But its wings are leathery, first of all, and also its body, if we look closely at its head, is covered with fur. So indeed, this is a mammal because its body is covered with fur, not feathers. And finally, we come to another arthropod, which, if we look at it, it has wings. It also has 6 legs. And while it's hard to see, its body is broken up into 3 specific areas. And so just basing it on the wings and the number of legs, we can identify this as an insect, which this is what we call a dragonfly. And we have successfully classified 4 organisms that you may or may not have recognized, but just looking at physical features that help us to identify it, we're able to put it into the correct level of taxonomy that we're dealing with.